Today we're going to finish section 8-2, our operations with complex numbers. So today what we're actually going to be doing is dividing complex numbers. So we're still in that section 8-2 in our Springboard book, but we're starting on page 129 today. So you might need a calculator and of course something to write with. Okay, so here we are on page 129, and we are going to start by talking about a complex conjugate because we're going to need these when we do division. Now, because I is technically a radical, because remember, I is the square root of -1. Okay, we cannot have radicals in the denominator. So if we have a I in the denominator, that is bad. So what we have to do is rationalize our denominators, just like we would if there was a normal radical in the denominator, we would rationalize it. So the way we rationalize is using something called a complex conjugate. So a complex conjugate is a complex number a plus bi. Its conjugate would be a minus bi. So the thing we have to point out here is the numbers stay the exact same. Okay, so in this example, they have 2 plus 3i. The conjugate is going to be 2 minus 3i. So the numbers stay exactly the same. The only thing we change is the sign. We just change it to the opposite sign. So plus turns to minus, minus would turn to plus. Okay, so for example, in number 12 here, 12a gives us this complex number, 2 minus 9i. So its conjugate would be 2 plus 9i. So again, everything stays the exact same. You just flip the sign of the number. Okay. So what would the complex conjugate be if we had, for b, if we had -5 plus 2i, what's its complex conjugate? Well, in this case, hopefully you put -5 minus 2i. So you keep the numbers the exact same. All you do is just switch the sign in the middle. Now, the reason we need a complex conjugate is because when we multiply a complex number by its conjugate, it's going to eliminate the I terms. So, for example, if I use this one, a here, 2 minus 9i, and I multiply it by its conjugate, which we said was 2 plus 9i, here's what happens when I multiply this out. So watch me FOIL this. We have 2 times 2 is 4. We have 2 times 9i would be positive 18i. Then we have our middle terms. That's going to give me negative 18i. And then our last term is going to give me negative 81i squared. Now the point of the conjugate is to eliminate these middle terms. So you see how we have 18 minus 18? Those would cancel. From our last lesson, we learned that I squared turns to -1. So this actually turns to 4 plus 81, because negative gives me a positive. So if I add that together, we get a number of 85. So this will always happen when you multiply a number by its complex conjugate. All the i's will cancel out and you're only left with a number. Okay? So let's actually divide some problems here. So here's the example from your book. So what you do is you start by multiplying the numerator and the denominator by the complex conjugate. And the one part we look at for the complex conjugate is always the denominator. That's the only thing we really care about, because the denominator is where we can't have a radical. You can have a radical in the top, but not in the bottom. So if you see here, they took the denominator and they found the complex conjugate, and they multiplied the top and bottom by it. You got to keep it balanced. So whatever we multiply in the bottom, we multiply the same thing on the top. Okay? And then we just multiply across. But again, the point is to get the bottom to be a plain number, because all the i's will cancel out. These cancel. I squared becomes -1 and all that. Okay? I personally would not write my answer like this. I would just keep it as this big fraction. So the less extra work you have to do, the better. But let's try some examples together here. So we're just going to do B and C on the next page. D, we're not going to worry about that radical in there. Now you're going to need some space to do these, so the book did not give us enough space. So I'm going to go ahead and just move to another screen here. So these are the examples from this page here, page 130. Okay, I'm just doing them on another screen to have a little bit more space. Okay, So right now we have an I in our denominator, which is not allowed. We can't divide by a radical. So what we have to do is multiply top and bottom by the complex conjugate. And again, we only care about the denominator, so that's where you get your conjugate from. So we see how this denominator has a 2 plus 3i. Its conjugate then would be 2 minus 3i. Whatever I multiply the top by, or the bottom by, I have to do the same thing to the top. So I have 2 minus 3i on top and bottom. Now we just have to multiply this out. So on top, I really just have to distribute that 5i. So 5i times 2 is going to give me a 10i. 5i times negative 3i is going to give me a negative 15. I times I gives me I squared. Now we'll clean that up kind of in a little bit, but I'm just going to kind of multiply through right now. On the bottom, we're going to have to FOIL this out. Okay, but there's some shortcuts that we'll talk about, but the first thing we have to do is we're going to FOIL it out. So I'm going to take 2 times 2. 2 times 2 is 4. Now, this is where I said there's some shortcuts here. If I do the outer terms, that's going to give me negative 6i, but then I'm going to have plus 6i. So those middle terms always cancel. So really, all you need to care about is the first terms, so 2 times 2, and the last terms, so 3i times a negative 3i. So that's going to give me negative 9i squared. Okay, so in both of these, we have some I squareds here. I squared always changes to a negative 1. So on top, if I have negative 15 and then a negative 1, that's going to give me a positive 15. So plus 15 up here. On the bottom, that I squared turns to a negative 1, so same thing. That becomes 4 plus 9 on the bottom. 4 plus 9 is 13. Now that there's no more I in our denominator, that's how we know we are done with the problem. Okay, so we multiply top and bottom by the conjugate. Use some shortcuts where you have them. The middle terms always cancel, so you don't necessarily have to write those. You just need the first term and the last term. So the first term and the last term. Okay, so let's try one more problem, and then you guys are going to try one. So let's look at C here. So C, I have 5 plus 2i divided by 3 minus 4i. So again, we have to look at our denominator because that's where the problem is. We cannot have an I in the denominator. So 3 minus 4i is what we're looking at. I need to multiply top and bottom by that conjugate in order to clear that I out of the denominator. So 3 minus 4i, its conjugate would become 3 plus 4i. Whatever I multiply the bottom by, I have to do the same thing on the top. Okay, so this one's going to be a little bit of work because we have 2 terms on top and bottom. So we're going to have to FOIL twice here. So let's just go kind of one part at a time. So I'm going to multiply the tops together. So I'm going to FOIL this out. 5 times 3 is 15. 5 times 4i is going to give me 20i. 2i times 3 is going to give me a 6i. And last, 2i times 4i is going to give me a 8i squared. So there's my numerator. My denominator, we have to FOIL this out. We have 3 times 3, so that's 9. This is going to give me 12i, but then I just subtract it right away, so that cancels, so I don't really have to worry about it. But I do need to worry about negative 4i times 4i, which is going to give me negative 16i squared. Okay, my I squareds turn to negative 1s, so this becomes 15 minus 8. 15 minus 8 is 7. 20i plus 6i is going to give me 26i on top. So there's our numerator cleaned up. On the bottom, same thing. I squared turns to negative 1. So this becomes 9 plus 16 because it changes the sign. 9 plus 16 is 25. And there is your quotient. Okay, so let's look at both of these together here. So again, you look at your denominator and multiply top and bottom by that conjugate. All you're doing is just multiplying across. So on letter B, I only had one term on top there, so I just distributed it through. In part C, my numerator had two terms. That's why we had FOIL on top and FOIL on bottom. But remember, on the bottom, you have a little shortcut because your middle terms will cancel. Don't forget to change your I squareds to -1s, flipping your signs around. And then just make sure you kind of combine all your like terms. So I'm going to have you guys try this one on your own. I kept it kind of nice with just one term on top. So it's 5 divided by 2 plus 5i. So first start with what is the conjugate here? If we have 2 plus 5i, what's its conjugate? And then once you have that set up, you're going to multiply top and bottom by that conjugate. So go ahead and give this one a try really quick. Okay, so here's the answer if you did everything correct. It's 10 minus 25i all over 29. So here's my work for this. So I had my conjugate, 2 minus 5i. I multiplied that by top and bottom. So on top, when I distributed it, I got 10 minus 25i. On the bottom, when I FOIL that out, the middle terms ended up canceling. So I ended up with 4 minus 25i squared. That I squared changes to -1, flipping it to plus 25. So 4 plus 25 is 29.